I'd like to welcome you all here, but also I'd like to welcome those people who are tuning in from home, wherever you are through our YouTube channel this afternoon, The Wonders of Technology. As always, before we start, we have a few housekeeping rules to go through, but you don't need to do this at home. Firstly, can I ask you to switch your mobile phones off to silent? And secondly, more importantly, there are no fire drills scheduled this afternoon, so if one does go, it means it's real. So please exit by the door you came into, heading on to George IV Bridge. But don't worry, staff will be here to help and guide you. Now, I hope, like me, you've got a bit of a spring in your step, with the nights getting longer and the colours in the parks and gardens becoming vibrant and a joy to behold. You can tell I wrote this before the little bit of spell of weather we've been having just now, especially this afternoon. But I hope you're lucky enough to be able to get out into the garden. It's a really exciting time with so much to do before summer arrives. And of course, watching the birds building their nests and enjoying everything that nature intends us to enjoy. But what should we be doing to help the wildlife and indeed us in our gardens, no matter how big or small the garden is? This afternoon, I'm delighted to be introducing Kirsty Wilson, who is here to talk about a new book called Planting with Nature, a guide to sustainable gardening. Kirsty is garden manager at the Royal Botanic Garden, Edinburgh. She is also TV presenter on BBC TV's Beach Grove and appears on BBC Radio 4 Gardens Question Time as a panellist. Further to this, she is an award-winning garden designer, photographer, and a member of the RHS Herbaceous Committee. I'm pleased I got that word right. Now, before handing over to Kirsty, we will have time at the end of the talk to ask some questions. So please get thinking here, and we can also take questions from anybody viewing in through the
to everyone online. It's a great privilege to be here talking today about my new book, and it is very exciting. So this book I actually started writing during the pandemic, really, and at a time which was quite worrying for the whole world, and it gave me a time to sort of slow down and observe nature in the Royal Botanic Garden, Edinburgh, and just observe it a bit more closer. And the Botanic's main mission is exploring and explaining plants for a better future. And that is our core aim, both education, conservation and scientific research, all linked to plants. And we have many issues facing the world at the moment, from biodiversity loss, species in decline, climate change. A lot of our wildlife is under threat. So this sort of inspired me to think, what can we do? We can hear all these sort of sad, declining messages in the news, but what can we do in our own gardens, whatever the size? Whether you've got a small garden to a large garden, or even a balcony, or an allotment. That's more worrying. Technical. Here we go. That's okay. Basically, I want to chat. I don't want to give too much of the book away, but I want to talk about some myths related to gardening with nature and a bit about wildlife gardening, which is very popular at the moment. And I want to say how much potential there is in the UK. So it can act like a whole mosaic, all our gardens linked together. So there are 87% of British homes that have gardens, and there are about, I think the RHS have actually brought out a new figure now that says there are 30 million gardeners across the UK. And this has great potential for our wildlife. So you can see there are 28 million trees in our gardens. There are 4.7 million nest boxes. We have 3.5 million ponds, so that could be a large pond, a small pond, maybe even in a pot. And then 12.6 million UK households feed birds as well. So that's huge potential of what we can do. Gardeners who adopt wildlife-friendly practices, such as planting shrubs and flowers or digging wildlife ponds, see more bird life, and in all, a lot more wildlife. So, these are all going the wrong way. next slide, so we're okay. So basically, I wanted to just highlight that with nature, it's all interconnected in our gardens. So everything from that small ladybird to birds eating certain small insects and invertebrates. It's a whole ecosystem. So you just need one of these species to be out of balance, and then that whole ecosystem is in flux. So that's why it's so good to have as much wildlife as possible. You know, nature is all interconnected, and I think sometimes we forget that we're not just the only species on Earth. There are lots of different animals and insects and invertebrates, all pollinators, all on our planet, and it just shows how complex nature and these ecosystems can be. And I just want to highlight the illustrations from the book is actually illustrated by Hazel France, who's a horticulturist at the Botanics, and she's done these beautiful creative illustrations. She's actually studied horticulture. Sowing a pot or a border with nectar-rich annuals, and you'll see at the Botanics over the last couple of years we've been planting a pollinator-friendly mix that leads up to the Botanics cottage, and it has a lot of variety of nectar-rich annuals that are really good for pollinators. So Kenny, we'll go for the next one. So I just want to cover a few wildlife gardening myths. So these are the 5 that I'm going to mention. So only wildlife gardens are good for wildlife. Size matters, and then you must only plant native species, and then lawns are bad for wildlife, and then wildlife gardens must be tidy. So we'll go with the next slide, Kenny, please. So only wildlife gardens are good for wildlife. So research studies of randomly selected gardens show that ordinary gardens can be extremely rich in species. So that's what I've just been highlighting. And many garden habitats mimic diverse semi-natural ones. Continuous change in plant diversity prevents a few species dominating. So that means you want things to be very diverse in planting so that it will promote everything. And then great variety of physical structures of vegetation, lawns, shrubs, trees, perennials and annuals. Domestic lawns can contain a surprising number of species. And then this lovely illustration that Hazel's done at the bottom shows a log pile. And in the book we mention how valuable dead wood is and how we shouldn't be, always clearing dead wood away. I also mentioned how to make a dead hedge, and actually that dead material is amazing for invertebrates and fungi to break down. Obviously, all plant life is trying to break down into compost, and many of the insects that are interlinked into that whole ecosystem come from dead wood. So that shows that we shouldn't be too tidy in our gardens and have areas that are really good for wildlife. I've learned the other day that hedgehogs tend to live in our compost heaps, or they're in your, she says they're amazing in dead wood sort of piles like that as well. And that's what we need to have in our garden. So we'll go for the next one, Kenny. And size matters. So that goes back to that study where that lady was finding tons of species in her garden. So this species vs area relationship is a general rule in ecology, but research has shown the weak linkage between garden size and species diversity. So you might have just a tiny garden, but you can have a bit of wildlife enhancing and making the world, better in your own space. So you might not have a wildflower meadow, but your neighbour might, but you might have particular species of nice trees or shrubs. So living in that street, you're creating a whole mosaic across the country of gardens that can benefit wildlife and nature. So gardens don't appear in isolation, and they are part of a wider landscape. So just think how many of us all have that garden space and can make a difference in our own home. So we'll go for the next one. So there's been much debate over the years about native plants and non-native plants. And many ecologists previously thought that only native plants, so that's plants to the UK, are best for wildlife. But they're finding now we're living in more and more urban areas, and native plants and non-native plants can have both bonuses. And obviously, as us gardeners, when you go to a garden centre, many of these plants are cultivars or plants that have come from around the world and provide a lot more diversity. But when if say you're planting a wildflower meadow, it is better to try and source seed that is local to your local area, as it is good for wildlife. But there are exceptions in scientific studies where this is hotly debated, so I don't want to get dragged into it too much. But it does show that a garden can be important for pollinating insects. Residential gardens can provide an estimated 85% nectar in UK cities, and non-native plants are a key source. So it just shows that they don't all have to be native species. So we'll go for the next one. And then lawns are bad for wildlife. So the Sheffield Bugs project recorded 159 plant species in 52 garden lawns. And at the Botanics, we have a wildflower meadow, a living lawn, and these annual mixes that are great for pollinators. But a living lawn is a lawn that is only cut every 3 weeks and is at a low sward height, so about 10 centimetres, and it's using native seed to our area, and the flowers adapt to flower at a lower height, and your lawn is full of lots of rich wildflowers, and a lot better for biodiversity, and you can play on it, you can picnic on it, and you can run on it. So it's much better than that monoculture grass, that striped lawn that has been very fashionable in the past, but now these wildlife friendly lawns that have a nice low sward height and are great for wildlife. We did a trial plots of these living lawns, and now we have 1,000 metres squared area of this living lawn. And also the great advantage is you only have to cut it every 3 weeks, not every week like a traditional lawn. So having these living lawns, wildflower meadows, have got huge potential to help pollinators and wildlife in your garden. So I would highly recommend that. And we'll go for the next one, Kenny. So here's just some examples. So this is like the annual meadow I'm talking about. An annual meadow would die in a frost. So we sow that every year in about May time, and then it'll be flowering from July till the first frost. But a native perennial meadow, once you prepare the ground and plant it, it'll come up year after year. So if you've got the space for either of these, this annual meadow you could grow in a pot or a container. And the native meadow, if you really don't want too much work, you can actually now buy it in like turf, and you almost roll it out like a carpet, and you have an instant meadow effect. If you're sowing it from seed, it can take a little longer. You might have a grass area that is, you don't want to turn it over and start fresh with bare soil. And you can plant things like yellow rattle, which is a parasitic plant that will weaken the grasses and then provide pockets for wildflower meadow flowers to go into, and that's where you can then plant plug plants into it. But I do go into quite a bit of detail of how to do this in the book, so won't give too much away. But Kenny, your next one. Thank you. And then wildlife gardens must be untidy. So this perception of this rewilding confusion message between wildlife gardening and rewilding, it doesn't mean we should just abandon our gardens and walk away from them. It means that we just have to have wilder areas and not be as tidy as we have been sometimes. But social norms for overly tidy gardens can be detrimental to biodiversity. So they've also found in studies that gardens in poorer neighbourhoods have better bees, like a higher count of bee species in that area. So we need to overcome these sort of norms of, collecting that leaf litter in every year, wait all winter. I leave all my herbaceous perennials till January, February, and then cut them down, because all the invertebrates and insects are all hiding in these stems through the winter period. Whereas in the past, a lot of the time with traditional herbaceous borders and things, we're trying to cut them down and clear them and make it as neat and tidy as possible. So if you can just be a little bit more patient and try and be a bit more relaxed in your garden, that will really benefit wildlife and biodiversity. So we'll just go for the next one, Kitty. So this is a lovely illustration showing there's many exciting ways of how nature can be brought into our gardens. So you might have a bin store or a small sheltered building like this or a shed, and you can actually put a green roof on the top. You might be able to put a green roof on the sides. And this is a lovely meadow going up to it, and it just shows that plants can really enhance the aesthetics of a garden and help wildlife. So there's so much potential in our gardens rather than tarmacking them over or putting down astroturf. I'm not a huge fan of plastic grass because I don't think it does any value to wildlife at all. You may as well just cement over the whole garden. And remember, plants, after all, give us oxygen. They are life. And without them, we won't be here. So we'll go for the next one. But this is a lovely illustration that Hazel's done. So just a bit of a summary of what wildlife need from our gardens. So first up, they need food. So new plantings, how pollinator friendly are they? How can you add shrubs that are going to have the nice fruit for the birds to eat? And then water, ponds and other water features, are they suitable for wildlife? Can a hedgehog climb out? They actually swim in ponds and will need fresh water. Can they climb out? So it's sometimes good to put a ladder into your pond if it's very deep so they can actually get out. So it's just having these considerations, but water, as soon as you put a pond or any sort of water body into a garden, the wildlife will all come. Tadpoles are amazing with children, showing them that in the spring as well. So, and then connectivity, are there linkages to the wider surroundings? So don't have a garden which is just solid fencing. It's actually better to have hedging and areas and corridors for wildlife to move through and between your garden to your neighbours as well. Particularly even hedgehogs, I'm using that example again, but if you have a fence and they can't go under it, how will they get to move through that mosaic of habitat as we're talking about? And then shelter, so do timings of activities such as hedge pruning and cutting back borders. How does that impact wildlife? The botanics were not pruning or cutting shrubs when nesting birds are in there. So that's particularly from about March all the way through till sort of August, end of August, September time. And that way you're not disturbing any young. And then no harm. Does new design or developments take biodiversity into account? So many people are now paying for lovely gardens to be designed by designers, but they're also putting in lighting. And it does look lovely, but is that lighting affecting wildlife that would be nocturnal? So if you have lighting, maybe only have it on for a few hours and don't leave it on all through the night, because that is going to affect nocturnal wildlife. Nest sites, are there log piles? As I mentioned, dead wood is so valuable. Just make a small pile of dead logs or a dead hedge, and that will just rot down nicely and is really good for wildlife. Leaf litter is amazing. As I was saying, don't be too clean and tidy on your borders. And obviously there's many insect, bug hotels. You can buy some sort of hedgehog boxes and things, but they are probably happiest in compost. And bird boxes, bat boxes are all great. And actually there's many declines in birds, bees, bats, pollinators. They're all in decline at the moment. So anything that we can do to provide a home for them or provide food or habitat is a great thing for us to do. So we'll just go to the next one. So the challenges, so I'm going to mention a little bit about garden pesticides. So there have been a number of studies that people who don't use pesticides and weed killer, they actually see a lot more wildlife. So in the past, there has been a lot of a sort of culture of just spray straight away as soon as you see green aphids on your roses. And that's really damaging to wildlife. And actually, if we're just a bit patient, then ladybirds will come and eat those green aphids on our roses. So yeah, there's been the experiment which surveyed 615 gardens in Britain, found 25 fewer house sparrows and glyphosate was used regularly. Glyphosate is commonly found herbicide such as Roundup and Gallop. And then it's the same with slug pellets. People are finding a huge impact on bird life in their garden when they're using chemical slug pellets, and they're actually now very effective nematodes, and they are nematodes are biological controls that are like bad bugs eating good bugs or small organisms that can break down these bugs that you don't want or slugs and things. and there's organic slug pellets as well, and these are all environmentally friendly organic options, and you'll see a lot more wildlife and won't damage wildlife going forward. So we'll go for the next one, Kerry. So yeah, and then it's a sad case with bees as well. So the more pesticide used, the more effect it's having on bumblebees. So this is just last year, this study came out, and it was in an article in The Guardian. So glyphosate, which is the weed killer that you would normally get in your garden centre, has been on the market for over 40 years, but it was long declared to be harmless from animals, but more and more studies are showing that the weed killer damages wild bee colonies. They're not able to regulate their temperature in their nests, so it just shows that chemicals are not part of that natural environment, and we shouldn't be spraying them in our garden if we can. But you know, I have worked in many gardens, and it's about an integrated pest management. So sometimes the last option, you might have to use chemical, but in your own garden, I would not advise spraying any pesticide, because obviously you can see how damaging it is to bees and wild bee populations. So we'll go to the next one. So I just wanted to highlight, I'm a garden designer as well, so some things that really upset me are plastic turf. And it's becoming more and more popular. Obviously, we all live busy lives, but and obviously this one doesn't require any care, but that is doing no value for nature or wildlife at all. And it is very sad. You know, you could have a much more biodiverse, rich garden. And the same, obviously, in our gardens in the cities. We now a lot of pressure for parking, an area to, you know, in front of your own front garden, your home to park on. So that's eating up.
A lot of people are doing that.
Yeah, so that's eating up a lot of space that can be used for plants and wildlife. So, but not singling out anyone, but it can be quite bad. Next one, Kerry. Oh, he's off. Yeah, and then this is just examples as well, and it just shows if, you know, new architects, landscape architects are working on new housing developments, this is no use whatsoever. No wildlife can move between them. Many people are moving into new properties or get a new garden like this, and they say, how do I get wildlife into that space? But until you put in shrubs and trees, then there's, you know, you have to create the habitat for the birds, and you need the pond as well. So as much movement and mosaic through your gardens as possible, and sometimes leaving a small gap at the bottom will allow wildlife to move through, or, you know, they need areas to perch on birds as well, roost and nest and feed. So we'll just go for the next one. So I just wanted to also mention, I mentioned rain gardens in the book, and at the Botanics over the last 4 to 5 years we've been doing this research study with Heriot-Watt and the Water Academy, and with climate change we're now seeing extreme downpours of rain. I know it's quite dry recently, but what we're seeing is this sort of flash flooding event, and it can really affect the garden, affect paths, and it can also affect our own homes, our own streets, our own lives. So this is, how are we going to adapt to climate change moving forward? So we decided to find an area in the garden that was very bad at flooding. So under this tree was a lawn area, and it was particularly bad at flooding. So we then decided to create a rain garden. So that's a nature-based solution, and using plants a bit like a sponge to absorb that extra water. And you can do this in your own home garden, whether you take water off a downpipe, or you might have an area that floods or is quite wet. But if you plant it up, that will absorb that extra water. And we've written a scientific paper. There's information on the website, and it's been featured quite a lot in the media, and this area now doesn't flood at all. So we'll show you the next one. And we've got lovely species in it, both Scottish natives and non-native plants, so plants that you might be able to get in your own garden at home. And many of the plants are also good for biodiversity and pollinators as well, being nectar rich, open flowers. We also have a native Caesarerbata alpina, which is only on 4 sites in the Cairngorms and critically endangered, and it is thriving in the rain garden at the Botanics. And this is a drone shot that I've taken of the space above. And what we did to create this rain garden was create a berm, they call it. So we then mixed the soil, sort of made a mounded shape like this, and mixed the soil with a lot of sand and grit and made it very free draining. So this area did flood, but it now drains through it very quickly. And then a nice gravel mulch, so that keeps it nice and low maintenance, but that also aids drainage too. So we'll just go to the next one. So this just shows some of the nice pictures. This is the critically endangered alpine sow thistle that I mentioned in the Cairngorms, and we do a lot of work at the Botanics to plant that back out into the wild in Scotland and have it in the Botanics as well to help conserve it. This is another nice Scottish native, Nautia arvensis, with a lovely bumblebee on it. So having these flowers that are open pollinated, you never want anything that's like double flowered, because then pollinators can't access the nectar and the pollen, which is so critical. And we've got a nice primula. And the thing with rain gardens, people always think it's bog-loving plants. But with this research study, these plants have to be able to cope with drought and intense rainfall. We're not going to water this rain garden at all. So it's finding plants that are adaptable, because we're getting more extreme weather. So it's an extreme drought for a few months, and then it's an extreme flood, basically. And we did see Stockbridge flood a lot last summer, so, and you know, it can impact all our gardens. So if we, instead of tarmacking over in that front garden as I showed you, you actually used plants and planted it up, or took that excess water off your downpipe, it can really have a great impact. And then you're helping biodiversity and nature at the same time. So I show you how to create rain gardens in the book as well. So next one, Kitty. So yeah, this shows a lovely downpipe with a planter, and they can be really attractive, and these can be fitted onto the side of buildings. And we're actually, the Botanics are doing a bit of biodiversity outreach. How can we help biodiversity in cities? And I'm working on a few projects at the moment. So one of them is actually create one of the bluest and greenest car parks down at Craigleith Retail Park, and put rain gardens into that area which floods. And it's a big collaborative project with Nature Scot, the Botanics, landscape architects, engineers, Savills, and trying to help biodiversity and allow us to adapt for climate change going forward. So yeah, we'll just show you the next one. So overall, I just want to summarise what are the main themes in response to the book. So what is inside the book is creating a nectar border, so that's really good for pollinators, and how can you do that? Planting a wildflower meadow, I go through a step-by-step easy guide on how to make one. And then creating a native hedgerow or a wildlife fence, so that's using both climbers or native hedging plants that are going to be really good for wildlife. How to plant trees and shrubs for wildlife, and then I also mentioned bug boxes, bird boxes and feeders, where they should be positioned, how to add them to your garden, and then wildlife and container ponds. And then obviously I just mentioned rain gardens, so we go into how to create a rain garden and water management in your home. And then also creating green roofs and living walls. It's very exciting how we can, enhance all our areas, particularly in urban environments, using living walls or green roofs. And then how to make your own compost, how valuable compost is, how important it is, and just a step-by-step guide. So say you were new to gardening, or you have anyone that's just bought a property, this is a fantastic book for them to start learning the basics of gardening. And then creating new plants for free propagation. I just mentioned how to propagate plants. That's one of the most fascinating ways to keep developing plants, passing them on to friends, and it's a cheaper way to produce plants. So that's everything covered, I think. And then we can just go into questions, if Kenny's okay. He's a lovely blue tit. No, Hazel's done a great job, because she's got the horticultural skills and an illustrator. Her illustrations are beautiful, but she probably would have liked to have been here today, but she's working away.
Thank you so much. So we can open the floor to questions. We can also open the virtual floor to anybody that may want to ask a question. Does anybody in the audience have a question just now? Yes, couple. Bear with me. I move slower these days.
Thank you. Where do you stand with moss in lawns? Is moss any good for wildlife?
Well, I grew up on the West Coast, so there was a lot of moss in our lawns, and I think they're fantastic. Yeah. And there's actually one of our scientists at the Botanics has just written a book at the same time as me on hidden mosses, and they're actually a great for biodiversity and wildlife as well. They're their own entity as well, and they are helping the world as well. So I think it's tricky when you live in a wet climate where you do have moss, but to spray chemicals and try and get rid of moss, just enjoy it and not everyone has moss. If you go to Japan, moss is everywhere and it's very in. So I think just try and live with it. Sorry.
I love the fact you said that I don't need to cut my grass for 3 weeks and now I don't need to rake the moss out. That's fantastic.
I've got a reasonable-sized pond. And
if you could just put them on.
Oh, right. A reasonable-sized pond, which was absolutely full of frogs. And then I introduced newts into the pond. And the frog population has kind of disappeared. And when I still have some frog spawn, but that disappears fairly quickly. And I don't know, I just seem to have knocked off the balance. Should I worry about it or just let nature sort itself out?
I think I've just let nature sort itself out. Both newts and frogs are amazing. So if you've almost got a balance of both. Yeah, you're right. As soon as you put the newts in, you're going to have less frogs. So yeah. Frogs, yeah. And someone was even saying this is not a great year for tadpoles. They hadn't seen that many, but it's almost like trying to find some and keep introducing them into the area. You might be able to, go and get some frog spawn and then release it into your garden, so you have a few more. But yeah.
Could I ask what plants you would advise for a rain garden, especially one which is an arboretum here in the city?
So in the city here? Yeah, so there is the whole plant list for the rain garden that we've created at the Botanics online. It's both in a scientific paper and on the website. But we've got things like hostas, ligularia, we've even got large gunnera, so giant rhubarb. We have Filipendula, so that's meadowsweet and quite likes the moisture. We have primulas. I'm trying to think of everything now. But if you come to if you read online, there's a huge list. But trying to go for herbaceous perennials mainly. But you can put trees and shrubs into a rain garden area. The more plants, the better, and they act like that sponge absorbing that water. So you could go native, or you could go non-native, or you could have a mix of both. Is exactly what we've created at the Botanics, or come down to the Botanics and have a look at it. Yeah.
Right, we've been told that we've got to keep to woodland species.
Okay, so you could go more native and have nice things like sorbus trees, and then like native primulas. Or hostas, any herbaceous perennial would be quite happy. But as I was saying, they have to adapt to being dry and wet. So that's why this research study is so good, because we're now understanding grasses are very good because they can cope with both the wet and the dry. And it's finding these plants that are going to be able to cope. Because most plants just like wet or just like dry. It's finding this in between. And that's where this research study, it lists them all that are still surviving from this 4-year project with Heriot Watt.
Yeah, thank you.
I think we've got one question at the moment that's online, so I'll hand over to my colleague Beverly at the back.
Audience, I don't think so, not at the moment, but I think that is something that the Botanics could be distributing it more, and we could be growing it, but we are looking for safe sites across Scotland to grow it. So if you've got estates or a larger area of land to put the Cucurbita on. Cucurbita is threatened because of deer population and sheep's overgrazing the plant, and it grows very high up on mountain sort of ledges, and it's quite hard for our team to go and plant them back out. So it probably isn't available in the trade, and that's like most things, isn't it? And that's what I'm saying, that even in an urban setting, actually non-native plants is really beneficial to wildlife and pollinators too, compared to just having native. Yeah.
Any other questions? We've got one question that I got, Kirsty. I have a slight problem at the moment, and in my garden, so sweet peas are in, but the tomatoes are going in this weekend. Mm-hmm. But Last night, we were visited by a little rabbit. Exactly. Much as the rabbit looked so cute, we were thinking, what happens when, on a hot day, we open the door and the lovely tomatoes are there? What's your advice?
Well, so I've been promoting wildlife, obviously, and saying that, but there are some that can be pests, a bit like a rabbit, and I would try and rabbit-proof your garden. Can you put that low chicken wire fence, or build a wall, or around your perimeter? The other way to control them, sadly, is to shoot them. But I'm not promoting that too much. Or you.
The National Library of Scotland does definitely not promote that sentence.
If you want a garden, you would have to try and keep them out of the area as much as possible. Or you go for rabbit-proof planting and you only plant like larger shrubs or more robust herbaceous perennials that they won't eat. But they love that new fresh growth, and whatever sweet peas you put out, lovely, they'll just start nibbling away, and they breed incredibly fast. So once you've got a problem, you're going to have to.
Great. Well, there'll be a rabbit on the 8 o'clock train to Edinburgh tomorrow morning from North Berwick, so that's.
You can be a big problem as well. And obviously, I've just mentioned Cicerbita alpina, and a lot of our native plants are threatened by that across Scotland, is deer grazing. So. And overgrazing areas, it's better even on these sort of wildflower sort of pastures to move livestock. You don't overgraze a whole area because it's not good for biodiversity and wildlife.
Because that would bring me on to the question when I do travel up from North Berwick to Edinburgh, there's so much new houses going on. That must be having a huge effect on wildlife. Are the companies aware that taking all that land is having an effect, and are they doing anything?
And the thing is, I suppose they just have potential in these new gardens, but they need to be planting them up. Sometimes you can buy a new house and you only get the sort of turf planted straight away. But landscape architects need to sort of be being smart on even the street planting needs to be biodiversity friendly. It needs to have the habitat, the structure, the food, and then they need to look after the planting as well. And horticulture is such a skill; it needs to be valued. We need to. You can look at countries around the world like Singapore is amazing, planting millions of trees and in such a green environment and urban areas. And everyone needs nature. We're happier when we're in nature. We're better humans when we're out in nature and exposed to it. So as much nature as we can get in both our cities and in the countryside is better for the health of the planet going forward.
Great. Hold on, sir, if you can just take the mic.
A lot of fields have been sold off to house builders outside Edinburgh. Huge money been involved in that, and farmers selling their big areas of fields to house builders.
And it all stems from after the war, when obviously food production was so important and we ripped out many of our hedgerows and our wildflower. We've actually lost 97% of our wildflower meadows. It's only 3% left. It's staggering. So if you can have a wildflower meadow in your garden, that can really help. And I think even in agriculture, they're going to have to shift and bring back native hedgerows. And many farmers they do have strip planting, nectar borders, and we need that for crop production. If you have no bees, how will you have any apples? And pollination. So it's all interlinked, and you just need to have all of it declining for it to be really sort of scary, and we need to act. But as I showed, there's a huge range of gardens across the whole UK, and we are a lovely green nation, so we just need to all be doing a little something in our garden, as much as we can do.
Hi. Oh, sorry. From the background. Just wondering, I don't have a garden. Is there anything that I can do? Or, what's your opinion on sort of feeding birds from windows? Or, is that useful? Is that discouraged for various reasons?
Supplementing feeding for birds is no problem. And I say you don't have a garden, well, maybe come down to the Botanics and you could feed a robin. They're so tame at the Botanics with a mealworm. We wouldn't say no to that. And, if you've got a window box, you could plant it up with plants that are really good for pollinators. I also think for young millennials that can't get a garden, it's so important to have allotments, and we need to have more allotments across the city so that we can grow our own produce. You know, cost of living crisis, if we can have our own fruit and vegetable production, you know. But, you know, if you can just get out into a woodland or nature, then that will benefit you. But I don't see anything against feeding birds. No.
Yeah.
Just going back to your previous comment about all the new housing in East Lothian, my daughter is actually the biodiversity officer for East Lothian Council, and every single planning application has to go through her desk. So she advises all the planners on, you know, what has to happen, and every single plan is now scrutinised for biodiversity. She is totally overworked.
She needs a bigger team probably working on it, but that's fantastic. And I think, you know, there is a whole movement with it. Even David Attenborough's Wild Isles has really highlighted how wonderful our nature is on this island. So just, you know, I think that trend, wildlife gardening, is really happening. And, you know, many landscape architects and, you know, new buildings, I think in London there now, it has, if you build a new building, you have to have a green roof on it. And that's the way we need to go. Yep.
I am now your daughter's #1 fan, by the way. So
Well, what good work to do. Yeah.
Absolutely. Do we have any other questions? Nothing coming in from... Oh, we've got 2 questions. My apologies. Just him.
Just him, yeah. Kirsty, I was going to ask you what plants you would recommend for a small balcony.
Balcony. Well, it depends what aspect your balcony is. So is it sunny?
West facing, so I get sun sort of later in the afternoon, later in the day. It's probably about 3 foot by 7 foot, and there's a small wall, say about 2 foot around. I did have a couple of small privets there, and they haven't succeeded very well. I think I've got quite a cold blast of air coming over the top there as well.
Things like you obviously want to look out on a bit of greenery, so you can have a bit of structure, like as you say, you've got privet or maybe a yew sort of domed hedge or a hebe or something nice for you to have, you know, all year round green colour. But things like Nepeta are really good for bees, and you know, you want to be sitting on your balcony watching bees coming. I'm just trying to think. Nice things like Japanese forest grass can cope with a bit less shade, and it's a lovely green grass, and it has a nice structure all the way into the winter, and it grows under trees very well. So it would be happy and on, you know, in a container as well. I suppose you also want to think you could use things like annuals or sweet peas. They're very nice, but you know, if it's hard work, you don't want to be watering too much. As soon as you put containers, you're going to have to be watering, particularly in the summer most days. So trying to find plants like a geranium is very good. Geranium roseanne, it can flower for 6 months of the year. Great for bees, and it's really tough and would be happy in a container. So, and it's quite an award-winning plant. But yeah, okay.
Okay. Do we have any other questions? Oh, we have another question coming in from online.
This is a question about the book. Where is it possible to find the book?
I should have mentioned all of that. So it is at the Botanics shop. It is for sale in here, I believe. Is it? Yeah.
It is actually today. That's a very good question, because today the book is for sale. It's outside, and Kirsty will be going very soon to sign it.
Yeah, copies after this.
Normally the book is $14.99, but today you can buy it for £12. So hopefully that answers the question.
And it's also in all the normal, so it's on Amazon, it's in Waterstones, I think it's in Blackwell's, Toppings in St Andrews, or many bookshops in like Stockbridge as well, Bruntsfield. So yeah, hopefully.
In all good bookshops.
All good bookstores. I'm not
not
sponsored by any of them, but if you're desperate, well, obviously everyone sitting in this room could get a signed copy today, but if you're desperate for a signed copy, the Botanics have a nice pile of signed ones, both by the illustrator and I. They keep saying, run over and sign some.
Yeah, there might be some signed copies in the library as well, so there we are. If that's everything for this part of the afternoon, all I can say is thank you all so much for coming along this afternoon to join us. Thank you everybody online for joining us as well. I hope you've enjoyed the talk half as much as I have. I've learned so much. I'm off to buy a half-price ticket for a certain furry little animal for tomorrow. Apart from that, please join me in thanking Kirsty. Thank you.